From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, welcome. I'm under the impression that there is somebody who was to have introduced me, but I know many of you here are on your lunch hour, and we're 5 minutes into that lunch hour, so I think I'm going to go ahead and take the luxury of introducing myself and welcome everybody. I'm Susan Spellman. I am the Jameson Fellow here at the Library of Congress this year. It's a true pleasure to be here, and I thank the Library of Congress for giving me that opportunity to be the Jameson Fellow, to come back to the Library of Congress and work in the archives, which of course are fantastic. But I also thank the American Historical Association, which jointly sponsors the Jameson Fellowship, for the opportunity. And again, I want to welcome all of you and thank you for coming and spending your lunch hour with me so I could talk about grocery stores. Seems rather apropos, though, to talk about groceries on a lunch hour. So. My work here at the library is part, obviously, of a larger project that I work on that focuses on the independent grocery trade. So I work on small grocers, mom and pop grocers, corner stores. Those are probably common terms that you're familiar with and recognize them in that way. Here in the United States, we have a common impression about these kind of stores, especially in the 19th century, which is pretty much the focus for much of my work. We often think about these stores in nostalgic ways, thinking about them as, this kind of, pickle barrels and cracker barrels and backward kind of places, dusty shelves and, backward ways, and thinking about them in a business sense as potentially, barriers to moving forward, especially when, the big fancy chain stores come about in the 19-teens and 20s. My work, however, flips that idea a little bit and instead looks at these small grocers and small businessmen as innovators. And I do that in part because they lay the foundations for what we understand to be the modern grocery trade. We have to know what came before in order to understand what came later. And instead of looking at, say, an image that I've posted here, like this gentleman in Detroit, Michigan, round about probably 1900, 1905, you might be drawn to that image and think about, the dirty floors and the baskets kind of laying about, the stools a little askew, things looking maybe a little haphazard. Not that we wouldn't necessarily walk into this and think about it in, hygienic terms or organized or clean like we imagine our supermarkets today. I look at that image, though, and think, wow, this guy's got it going on. And this guy's got it going on in part because, one, of that big fancy cash register that's there. That is no cheap little item to have. But also, when you start to look beyond, the kind of obvious big ticket mechanical innovations and look at, the canned goods that are there and the way they're organized, and understand that it's the small guys like this who had to figure out ways to deal with major changes in the grocery trade that took place at the turn of the 20th century. Things like mass production, canning, advertising, marketing. These are the guys who have to figure out how to make that work in the context of their own small business, in addition to incorporating things like cash registers, mechanical innovations, and systematizing, routinizing their kind of ways of doing trade. So my larger project looks at innovation in a small business context, and among these small grocers in particular. Part of that innovation, I argue, is cooperation, which is what I want to talk about today, and the cooperative aspect of the retail grocery trade. Because as I'm going to try to argue to you folks today, the ability to band together and to cooperate through their business methods is a new way of doing business, but it's also one that has and does make an impact on the way business is conducted in the 19th and in the 20th century. So it's an innovation that may not seem so obvious as an innovation, but it's one that has a tremendous impact. So I've given you some images here of cooperative stores and cooperative groups, all of which I'm going to talk about today. Back in 1923, the president of the American Wholesale Grocers Association was able to reflect that, during the past 10 years, so say 1913 through 1923, that cooperation had really become the name of the game in the grocery trade. And part of what I'm going to suggest is that, yeah, by 1923, sure, it absolutely had become part of the name of the game. But I'm also going to suggest, and hopefully give up some ideas here, about the way cooperation really radically changed the grocery trade way back in the 1870s. And I'm going to start by talking about probably the most fascinating thing you'll hear about today, which is the 19th century grocery distribution network. I know that most of you in here probably know exactly how it works, but for those one or two of you in here who maybe aren't up on it, I'll give you a quick primer on it, because it's cooperation that begins in the 1870s that starts to change the way that the distribution network works. So, for a quick run through, at the top of the scale, if you will, the top of the distribution chain, you have the manufacturer, obviously makes goods, and as far as the business goes, he sells directly to wholesale grocers. Wholesale grocers are those who buy, typically in very large lots, and then distribute the goods, as we're going to find out, obviously, to the stores. And these little particular things that I'm talking about here in terms of the manufacturer only selling to a wholesaler and the manufacturer being dependent on the wholesaler for distribution are things that are going to really stir up the grocery trade in the 1870s and 80s in a big way. In the middle of this network, we have wholesale grocers. And again, the wholesalers buy big lots from the manufacturers. In the 19th century, manufacturers of grocery items are not equipped, nor do they want to necessarily distribute items and small lots of goods to the thousands of small, out-of-the-way often grocery stores that are across this country. The grocery trade in the 19th century is very decentralized. It's very diffuse. It's very scattered. These small stores buy very small lots. Manufacturers aren't equipped and don't want to distribute small lots to these thousands of grocers. So they depend on wholesalers to do that for them. So the wholesaler distributes all of those manufactured goods to retailers. And in the 19th century, there's quite a bit of argument about the fact that wholesalers should not sell goods directly to consumers. In other words, the wholesaler should maintain his place in the distribution chain and sell only to retailers. And this picks up quite a bit of flack, as we're going to find out in the 19th century. At the end of my story, consumers are obviously at the very end, but at the very end of my story are retailers. Retailers, like manufacturers, are dependent on wholesalers to get their stuff. They're dependent not just on one wholesaler, but lots of different wholesalers. And retailers, likewise, are intended to and should only, as far as most in the trade see it, sell only to consumers. In other words, a retailer shouldn't try to be a wholesaler in the 19th century. And there's, again, a lot of argument about this. All right, I give you this primer in part to talk about cooperation that begins in the 1870s. In particular, I want to talk about some of the problems that lead to this cooperation. One is competition, as you might imagine. All of these small stores, all of these wholesalers, they're competitive. It's a, theoretically free enterprise system. But in the 19th century, a lot of grocers are, and especially wholesalers, are starting to see free enterprise as a problem. This competitiveness only breeds evil, as some see it. And it breeds evil in one important way, in that the trade is unregulated, and this leads to some significant problems in terms of price cutting. This is one of the big problems in the 19th century grocery trade. Think about it. You have hundreds of wholesalers selling manufacturers' goods, fighting for the same business from small retailers. Your way to compete, obviously, is to sell your stuff cheaper. And so this evil of price cutting, as they see it, we might see it now as, this is just indicative of free market enterprise. Back then, it was seen as a problem for the trade, that it was demoralizing, they would talk about it in those terms, that cutting prices to the point where you couldn't make a profit was demoralizing both for the trade, but also for the individual. And the trade had this practice of what are known as loss leaders. Probably some of you have heard of this practice and know what it is. Well, guess what? It was around in the 19th century as well. A loss leader is, selling an item to the point where you're not making any profit on it, but you advertise it so cheaply in order to draw your clientele in. Walmart is familiar probably with this practice and does this, and every retailer these days does this. Well, they did it in the 19th century grocery trade as well, and in particular they did it with sugar. Everybody needed sugar, everybody bought sugar, everybody wanted sugar. Grocers expected to lose money on selling sugar. It was par for the course, but if a grocer could undercut his competitor and bring somebody in on the basis of cheap sugar, then they would do that. But again, this was seen as a big problem. If you're selling goods and not making any profit, and in fact losing money on it, then there's something seriously wrong. The other thing that came up in the 19th century in this distribution network was that it was inefficient. It's not efficient by our standards. Wholesalers, or having all of these middlemen, intermediaries, add costs to groceries. So it potentially raises the cost to consumers, and therefore it's seen as a big problem. It's inefficient, especially by our 21st century standards. How do we solve it? Well, in Boston in particular, the Boston Wholesale Grocers Association decided that they could fix the problems that were occurring in the 19th century grocery trade. And they started doing so in 1875 when they formed. And they say that they're organizing on the basis of regulating sugar prices. In other words, they're tired of losing money on it. They're tired of seeing the retailers lose money on it. So if they can regulate sugar prices, then this must be a good thing. But they're also interested in making certain that they affirm, as I say, their place in the distribution chain. There are a lot of people beginning in the 1870s and 80s who are thinking, do we need wholesalers? They just add to the time in distribution, but they also add to the costs. This isn't an efficient way of doing business. Do we need them? And wholesalers are arguing, oh yeah, you have to have us, and for all the reasons that I mentioned before, you need us. So they're trying to argue that they're necessary. So in 1875 and through the 1880s, who were the members of the Boston Wholesale Grocers Association? Nearly every Boston wholesaler. Well, this is going to be a problem, in part because they monopolize distribution. So they cooperate to the point of monopolizing the distribution of manufacturers' goods, not just in Boston, but also in the surrounding area. In other words, if you're a small grocer and you want to buy Quaker Oats, the only way you're really going to be able to get them is through the Boston Wholesale Grocers Association, one of their members, and guess what? They have cooperated to the point where they are setting prices on the goods that they're selling. So it reduces or potentially eliminates competition for a retail grocer. In other words, if you're a small grocer and you're trying to find your goods at a cheaper price, in the Boston area, it's not going to happen potentially because you've got to deal with one of these BWGA grocers. And basically what they've formed here is a cartel. Just as, the oil trade and in later years, the sugar trade. And it was cooperation or the formation of a network to control competition and to fix prices. So the Boston Wholesale Grocers Association is cooperation, maybe not of a way that you think cooperation. Often when we think about cooperation, it's in very positive terms. The Boston Wholesale Grocers Association thought their cooperation was very positive for them. Retailers, not so much. Because what was happening is that the BWGA in forming their association, had also made agreements with manufacturers for their goods, and they were getting kickbacks on their goods. In other words, if I sell so many Quaker Oats to Boston Grocers, I'll get some money. And this is no small amount of money. Let me tell you how big it is. These agreements they make, for example, with the American Sugar Refining Company, in a 6-year period, the BWGA and its members got kickbacks, if you will, from their agreements, as they like to refer to them, of almost $2.6 million. That's 1897 money. That's $40,000 per member, approximately. Cooperation's a great thing, ain't it? When you're on the receiving end of, a $40,000 kickback, over a 6-year period, cooperation looks pretty good. All right. They also made an agreement with the Curtis Davis and Company group, who manufactured a brand of soap called Welcome Soap back in the day. And in 1897, just the first quarter that they involved in this agreement, the BWGA received a check, 1 quarter's worth, for $10,000. Again, that's 1897 money. So these agreements were very beneficial to the BWGA, and you can imagine that they thought these, cooperation is a fantastic thing. And they also had an agreement with the American Cereal Company, manufacturers indeed of Quaker Oats at the time. So the BWGA and their cooperation, it monopolizes distribution among the retail grocers. And retail grocers in and around Boston, and guess what? This is happening not just in the Boston area, but across the nation as well. Chicago is another area where this is taking place, and upstate New York as well. But in Boston and other places, retail grocers weren't going to take it. They weren't standing around and waiting for things to change. So what do? They use cooperation in their own way to fight back. And they do this by forming buying syndicates. Now, this sounds very similar, and you might think it's related to, a kind of group I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, but rest assured that this is a new type of organization in the 1880s and 1890s. These buying syndicates are formed by retail grocers solely with the purpose of pooling their money, pooling their resources to get around the wholesale grocer. So these independent retailers, these small mom and pops, come together. They're very informal organizations. In fact, it's very difficult to find evidence of their activities. You have to read through the Boston Wholesale Grocers Association records, and they're just moaning and complaining about these buying syndicates and how they're really trying to take over wholesale trade, but they're also written about in the newspapers. So these informal agreements that the retailers make is they do something very unique for the time and something that will have a much larger impact by the 19-teens and 20s. They start to pool their money, their capital, if you will, their buying resources. I shouldn't say capital. They pool their money to buy goods directly from manufacturers. So they circumnavigate these wholesalers who have monopolized trade. And as anybody here knows, who anything about 19th and early 20th century business, this is starting to look and sound a little bit like what corporate chains do in order to make their business run more efficiently. Except these guys are starting to do it in the 1880s and 1890s. And what they are able to do then by cooperating, these retail grocers, is to alter distribution path. I know, distribution. Doesn't sound exciting, but when you start to look at it from this standpoint of, this is the original network that I showed you, the distribution chain. What the buying syndicate groups were doing was making it look more like that, which again reflects and starts to look more like vertical integration, something again that we attribute primarily to corporate chains in the 19-teens and 20s. So again, it's very difficult to find great evidence about how these retail buying syndicates work. However, the American Grocers Society, their brochure here, which organized in 1914, actually a little later than the Boston group, managed to, in time, become one of the largest buying syndicates. At one point, they had 18,000 retail grocer members, and this is one of their buying lists. But what the American Grocers Society is doing here is really indicative of what the buying syndicates of the late 19th century were doing, is that they were really creating a way to make business and distribution more efficient, but also to bypass these, cooperative groups of wholesale grocers. So if you were interested in buying goods from the American Grocers Society, you had one price on the left, which is the price that if you bought that particular product through a wholesale grocer, you'd have to pay. However, if you were a member of the AGS, then you could get it as substantially less by, again, avoiding the middleman, taking out the wholesaler from the distribution equation. And to be a member of these buying syndicates, you had to pay some money, as did the AGS. So cooperation in this way, the retailer way, is used to counteract the cooperation that the wholesalers were trying to use to their advantage. All right, so what about these wholesale groups? Well, this cooperative power becomes very lucrative, as I pointed out. And the BWGA, which I started talking about at the beginning of this talk, regulates prices and trade for a very long time. Cartels in business tend to be very short-lived. The BWGA organized in 1875, and they were still regulating trade and competitive prices well into the 1915 era, and the organization stayed together until at least 1925. So this is a very long-lived organization that had a rather substantial impact, especially in Boston. There were other organizations, the Southern Wholesale Grocers Association, which was much larger and monopolized trade throughout the South. They got into some federal issues down the line, things that the BWGA managed to avoid for a very long time. The problem with the cooperation in this context is that the BWGA discriminates. So it uses cooperation in a not necessarily positive way for some, and blocks the ability of retailers to get some manufactured goods. And on the other hand, the wholesalers thought it was a boon, obviously in part because they're getting money, but also because by making these agreements with manufacturers, they were able to maintain their space and their place in the distribution chain. This is something that is going to obviously become increasingly important down the line. And so cooperation in these networks really start to work together, or I should say in opposition to one another. Wholesalers do cooperation in one way, retailers have to do it in another way to fight back. And this is a theme that we're going to find, obviously, as I move forward in the talk, that cooperation eventually for retailers becomes a way to fight back against large-scale power. And as far as this 19th century form of cooperation goes, I'm suggesting here that these alternative distribution paths are really what's important here in the way that cooperation worked. Because when you start thinking about the way goods are moved through these systems, the ability of retailers to effectively get around the middleman at the beginning, I should say the end of the 19th century, is a marked importance for the grocery trade. It leads to potentially a more efficient and more cost-effective, and as I suggested earlier, it really does start to anticipate what we recognize in chain stores that come in the 19-teens and in a big way in the 1920s and 30s. And that brings me to, again, another form of cooperating, one that is used to fight back against that vertical integration, or at least to meet competition through vertical integration in the chain stores of the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s. How many of you are familiar with the IGA? A few of you. Okay, great. IGA still exists. It is the Independent Grocers Alliance. So we're going to find out it was formed in 1926. So we'll talk more about the IGA in particular, but cooperative retailing becomes an effective way to kind of push back against corporate chains, as we're going to find out. Cooperative retailing takes buying syndicates that next step down the line. The buying syndicates of the 19th century really were just interested in buying goods collectively as a way to make it cheaper and to get around the middlemen. Cooperative retailing, as we're going to find out, is actually more involved because it takes advantages of distribution economies like vertical integration that are already in place because of corporate chains. But it's also used as a strategy to maintain their place in the grocery trade. As many of you in here know and are familiar with, grocery chains that come up in the 1920s and 30s have a profound impact on the small grocer. Mom and pop, take a pretty hard hit in the 1920s and 30s. But I would suggest that it wasn't a done deal. In other words, even in the 1920s and 30s, people were writing about the fact that, we're not sure that chains are necessarily going to eliminate mom and pop entirely because it hasn't been proven yet. However, the independent grocers recognized the fact that they had to do something in order to, maintain their spot in the retail grocery chain and trade. So they used cooperative retailing to make that happen. These are known as voluntary cooperatives. So in some ways, they look very similar in structure to corporate chains, but in important ways, they're different. This is a voluntary organization. Red and White is another important voluntary cooperative. Anybody heard of the Red and White? It's a very Midwest, Wisconsin sort of organization. And at one point, it was on par with the IGA in terms of numbers. So the voluntary cooperatives function in this way. An independent grocer volunteers to join with other independent grocers and come together under an umbrella organization, Red and White, IGA. They don't pool their money, however, so each store is owned independently still. So you get to maintain your say in terms of your particular store, but you have distinct advantages through cooperation with this larger umbrella organization and others in your area. And what they do is to work together with a central wholesaler. So in other words, you have 5 or 6 or 7 independent grocers who come together in a region, and they say, we want to join the IGA. And they sign an agreement. And what happens is then, now that they can buy from one central IGA designated wholesaler. And this gives them great benefits in terms of making the goods cheaper for them because they're able to buy at a much larger quantity, the wholesaler is. And then they're able to compete potentially with the same kind of buying power that the corporate chains have. The other advantage, or disadvantage, according to who you talk with, of a voluntary cooperative is that you are required to maintain uniform signage, advertising, and store arrangements. So, for example, the red and white that you see here in this image looked, in terms of the signs, looked similar to any other red and white store that you might come across. It needed to be a recognizable, logo. Again, they're trying to, in some way, mimic the corporate chain in order to compete with them. And it's a very popular way to cooperate. In 1931, there were upward of 19,000 grocery cooperatives across the nation. So this is not a small effort. This is actually a very large-scale movement. IGA in particular had upward of almost 7,000 independent grocers who became members of this organization. Red and White likewise had upward of 6,300 grocers across the country. But again, there were many other grocery cooperatives, many of them regional, Red and White and IGA were two of the largest that actually maintained a national presence. At one point, it was suggested that IGA actually had more members and more stores than the famous A&P did at its height. So it was able to, at least in a visual presence, seemingly compete with even the largest chains. The IGA forms in 1926. In order to become a member, you actually have to sign a 3-year contract agreeing to cooperate. And while you maintain independent ownership and control of your store, you actually have to give in to some promises and agreements, as they say. One is that your store has to operate on a strictly cash basis. Again, mimicking in some ways the corporate chain. Now, cash dealing and cash stores have been around since, the beginning of time, but the IGA mandates it now. This is something that's difficult in many ways for an independent dealer, especially when, the independent guy has been, the core of the community in many ways, and extends credit because neighbors and family and friends shop the store, and you're familiar with extending credit. But credit, as we all know, can get you into trouble. And so operating on a cash basis was always seen, even by many independent grocers before this, as obviously the best way to conduct trade and not overextend yourself in terms of credit. And you had to agree to paint your storefront and put on the IGA emblems in the 1920s and 30s. That was the popular IGA emblem. I actually have one of those on my office wall, I confess. And you had to agree to keep your store clean and orderly. Again, these are phrases and agreements and promises that are in many ways designed to counter arguments that corporate chains had been using against small independent retailers for some time. That, these guys, because they use credit, they can't be doing good business. Their stores are dirty, they're disorganized. So the IGA realizes that, we need to, fight back against those arguments. And you also had to agree to conduct your trade in a manner that will be a credit to the community. Well, what's that mean? That's up for grabs. The IGA offered up one suggestion in its advertisement to the public. In this 1931 ad, it draws on everybody's favorite grocer, Abraham Lincoln. Abe Lincoln did run a small store, long obviously before he became president. And what they do is suggest that, Lincoln is a great example of what the IGA stands for. In this age of machines and speed, Lincoln's traditions live on. Humanity, interest in people, loyalty to the principle. All of these are reflected in the ideals of the IGA. The one thing they don't note is that Lincoln's business failed. So maybe Lincoln isn't exactly the best, correlation here. However, IGA is riding this line between trying to look more like a corporate chain while maintaining that independent grocer spirit, if you will, and commitment to community. The other thing that it said about maintaining or conducting trade in a manner that's a credit to the community, well, the IGA actually defines that in an interesting way by suggesting that you have to render the highest efficiency and service. And so in that phrase, what I see happening here is a redefinition of small business. Small business, at one point was kind of that Lincoln or Jefferson-esque, if you will, independent spirit, small businessmen, et cetera, But by the 1920s and 30s, what's happening as I see it here, and you see just a little bit here with the IGA, is that efficiency and bigness start to become hallmarks of the way to conduct trade. And this is going to have a pretty profound impact on small businessmen, especially small grocers. Because owning a small grocery store was really one of the easiest ways to get into business. You could start a grocery with like $50 and a barrel of peanut butter. But by the 1920s and 30s, in order to compete against the corporate chains, it's not so easy. You can't necessarily do it with 50 bucks and a dream and some, gumption, as they like to say. Yeah, it has to happen on a much bigger scale. And so that really does start to change the way that small business is conducted. Much of what I've discussed here has focused primarily, I hate to say, on white grocers, because white grocers monopolized the grocery trade and much of small business, and business in particular, for a very long time. But as you can see by this image, African American grocers were not excluded. I've only been at the library on the Jameson Fellow for a couple of weeks, but in that time I have managed to achieve part of what I set out to do, is to find out a little bit more about African American grocers and their cooperative efforts. And in 1929, African American grocers combined to form the Colored Merchants Association. And this is their letterhead, if you will. And in many ways, they were following, obviously, the IGA, and they say quite explicitly that the IGA in many ways serves as an example for how they want to combine and cooperate in order to conduct business in the grocery trade. But their means and their methods for doing so actually differ from white grocers who belong to the IGA or the red and white. The Colored Merchants Association starts in Alabama, in Montgomery. Two grocers come together and say, the only way that African American businessmen, small businessmen, are going to be able to make it, especially in the grocery trade, is to work together, to cooperate. And they are supported by the National Negro Business League. And so I've had, again, the distinct pleasure of looking at the collections here of the National Negro Business League, but also the letters of Robert Moton, who was president at one point of the National Negro Business League, but also principal of the Tuskegee Institute. And in his letters, I have found great information about the Colored Merchants Association. Alban L. Halsey was responsible for organizing the CMA when it moved out of the South to New York City in an effort to become a national movement, a national organization. Halsey was secretary of the National Negro Business League at the time and became essentially president of the CMA and worked very hard to make a go of the organization. And as I've mentioned before, it resembled the IGA in its organization in terms of the kind of umbrella parent company at the top or organization at the top, each firm owned independently, et cetera, et cetera. Their goals for cooperating, however, again, differed from those of white grocers. They cooperate as a way to get into business and a way to get into the grocery trade, whereas white grocers with the IGA were looking just to maintain and hold on in some ways. Black grocers saw the CMA as a way to really enter into business, to get a foothold, and recognize the fact that only by pooling capital and pooling resources would they really be able to make a go of it. But they also see the CMA as a race movement, and this is something that comes out in the letters that Halsey writes to Robert Moton, but also in much of the literature that the CMA produces. This is, in many ways, an uplift movement, as they referred to it. It was a way to give black businessmen the opportunity to move forward and to advance. And it's not just opportunity for existing businessmen. There's actually quite a bit of talk about setting example and opening doors and opportunity for their children, and being able to start a small business as a way to encourage their children to get more knowledge about business. This was one of the things that was lacking most in the organization, was the lack of knowledge among African Americans of just basic business principles. And in the 19-teens and 20s, this seems, an obvious parallel to the condition of slavery. But this was also one of the things that they tried to counter by starting in business, pooling not just capital, but also knowledge and information as a way to better themselves as businessmen and create greater opportunity for the next generation. And so you might ask, well, why did they choose the grocery trade to cooperate? In other words, if black businessmen and black small businessmen are getting together, why the grocery trade? I have to say, the grocery trade is brutal. Very small margin. It's hard to make a living at it. And so in many ways, the CMA chose one of the most difficult businesses to break into, to make a success of. They chose it, though, because of the things that I mentioned before. Low entry barriers, we business folk like to talk about. Well, that just means that it was less expensive to start a grocery business, potentially, than having to start, say, a department store, something along those lines. So low entry barriers, African-American businessmen thought, we can start in this trade. And there's actually really terrific testimonials from a number of African-American businessmen who speak at the conferences sponsored by the National Negro Business League about their experiences. I had $40, I opened a store, and I made a success. I had $100, and I got a loan from a friend, and we started. So these low entry barriers are an important reason. And the other is that it's the scope of the African-American market. In other words, what they did was to look around and realize that if we could get black people to shop in our stores in cities that are dominated with black representation, then we will be able to potentially support ourselves. In other words, everybody needs to eat. And if we open a grocery store, we're almost assured that people are going to come in because everybody needs to eat. The other reason that they chose the grocery trade was that they were interested in getting involved with manufacturing goods, CMA branded goods. So they weren't just interested in retailing and selling to consumers. They wanted to make their own goods, and they were successful in many ways of doing that. One of their initial successes was with coffee, CMA brand coffee, as you can see from the advertisement here. And they also manufactured flour and cigars. So successful in that way. It makes them, as a group, rather unusual in some ways, although they are in many ways following the example of the IGA, which also manufactured their own goods. So the CMA had some great successes, but as you can imagine, some difficulties as well. They started in 1929. By the early 30s, say 31, 32, there are 270 CMA stores nationwide. And again, most of them are in the South and the East, New York especially, but Winston-Salem in North Carolina, which is where this image comes from. And they were successful in that way. And they put up a number of model grocery stores. Again, part of their goal was not just to make money, but to also train others to go into business. So they erected model stores and invited interested businessmen to come and look at their model stores. They erected these model stores with help from people at Progressive Grocer, which was the #1 grocery trade journal at the time. So they worked in cooperation actually with white businessmen from Progressive Grocer to erect these model stores. And this is the interior of one of those stores. And again, on the success level, they create opportunity and businesses for blacks. So they were successful, at least in the interim, in doing that. And they were successful in being able to manufacture their own goods. Had they taken off, might have had the opportunity to, push these goods into, white stores, not just CMA stores. And that was always their goal. They wanted to sell not just in black grocery stores their products, but they wanted to be able to cross the color line, if you will, and market them in white grocery stores. But the CMA faced a number of challenges. And from the letters of Alban Holsey, he makes it pretty clear that, not just in terms of the difficulties of the Great Depression, they probably chose one of the worst times to try to start in business in 1929. But in addition to the Great Depression, they struggled with getting the grocers themselves interested in cooperating and organizing. And, Holsey here is just saying, there's not a whole lot of enthusiasm from the grocers themselves, and he's puzzled by this. He can't, he never really is able to put his finger on what the issue is. And he complains in a more widely distributed newsletter that in 1932, in an 8-month period, they've only been able to sell $5,000 worth of CMA products. And he thinks that this is really subpar, that you really could have moved many more if we had come together. Remember, Wholesale and others see this in part as a race movement, and one of the things they struggle with is that black consumers are not going into black grocery stores. They're not supporting black grocery stores the way they thought. Part of the argument was that the goods were more expensive in black stores. Wholesale tried very hard to counter that without a whole heck of a lot of success. And in writing again to Robert Moten about Fred Moore, who was a prominent banker, black banker, he says, Moore and a number of others really don't understand the difficulties of the grocery business. Wholesale is essentially charged with coming up with this merchandising program, and in addition, again, he's just entered a very, very difficult trade to work with. And as he points out here, many of whom were ill-prepared, the grocers themselves, for the work they had selected. The consuming public isn't buying, they're not on par with, as he points out, race pride. There were just a number of problems. In 1934, it was announced that Wholesale was actually going back to Tuskegee to help out the school, and that basically signaled the end of the CMA. So it really struggled, 1929 to 1934, to be successful. It really struggled mightily. It had greater success, actually, as I've just recently discovered, in other cities. Cleveland's CMA actually persisted well into the 40s, and some of the CMA movements in the South and the stores actually persisted quite a bit longer than 34. But as far as the national umbrella organization led by Wholesale, it folded rather quickly, unfortunately. All right, everybody's favorite slide. Every time I go to one of these talks, I'm like, okay, so what do I take away from this? All right, in quick here. I'm suggesting cooperation's an innovative strategy. It's used in ways to change the grocery trade, modify business methods, modify distribution. It's used as a competitive strategy. It's used in a number of different ways. It's used successfully and not so successfully, depending. White grocers use it, both the BWGA and organizations like the IGA to maintain their place in the trade, especially with the situation of the BWGA, but they also use it to cooperate, to compete with chain stores with some success on that level. The IGA, again, in business for until today, even 2012. Black grocers use cooperation in different ways as a way to, again, enter the trade, not necessarily just to maintain, but to actually get a foothold, pool capital, and also as a race movement, again, with some success and some limitations on that. And what I'm ultimately arguing, in part, and where this work fits in, this talk fits into my larger work, is looking at these kind of voluntary chains, things like IGA and the Colored Merchants Association. Ultimately, as I alluded to a little bit, what happens is that you see a redefinition of independent entrepreneurship along lines of big business. And so in the grocery trade, being a mom and pop grocer becomes an avenue that's increasingly difficult to pursue on the scale and with the ease that it was in the 19th and maybe early 20th centuries. And it really starts to reshape how we conduct business, the scale we do it, and it really reshapes our definition of what a small businessman is and able to accomplish. So thank you very much for your patience. I'm happy to answer questions. You're first.
Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I'd like to ask you to deconstruct the category white as opposed to color. I would ask you to deconstruct
here. The air conditioning is really loud. So the question has to do with white and black, drawing white and black lines. And I've probably drawn them more simply here than they should be, in part, because again, as I allude to, the Colored Merchants Association, they do actually define themselves as a black organization. So that's a self-definition. But as I point out, they actually cooperate with white businessmen as well. And this is one of the arguments that is made, you know, by 1933 and 34, that the Colored Merchants Association isn't going to survive if we maintain those rigid lines of a black organization. So they actually make arguments about the fact that in order to be successful, we really need to cooperate more with white merchants, but also draw white consumers. We need to not focus so specifically on drawing black consumers. And they saw that as a downfall. As far as the white side of it goes, I have yet to come across evidence of a black grocer member of the IGA. And in fact, I've seen the opposite. One of the reasons that the CMA formed is because one of the guys who formed it in Alabama applied to the IGA, filled out the form and sent it in, and the IGA apparently told him, well, you're qualified and your business looks great, we can't accept you. So this is in part what spurs, you know, in the origins myth, if you will, the development of the CMA. Again, you know, I'm drawing the lines too clearly and too simply here. And as far as the gender issue goes, you're absolutely right that there are women grocers out there. One of the difficulties I've had in the course of this research is finding them, in part because in 19th century business records of small businesses are in of themselves very difficult to acquire. Add to that the fact that women often conduct business under their husbands' names in order to get credit with wholesalers and others. So trying to distinguish which are actually female-run businesses is tough. They're there. They're absolutely there. You can see them in city directories in terms of names often. But the records and, you know, the ephemera that is left from them is tough to track. You read the trade journals, every now and then you hear a mention of a woman running a store. It's a male-dominated trade, but there are women there. But it's also a family-dominated trade, as you point out. There are families that run these businesses. Absolutely. You had, and then you. Okay, yeah. And in fact, I mean, the question is about, you know, looking at European business models and how they come to the United States. And you're absolutely right, of course. You know, this is a system that comes initially, everybody points to England with the Rochdale system, R-O-C-H, Dale system of cooperation, that British grocers first figure out, you know, that these organizations of cooperation to kind of resemble, at that time they aren't thinking corporate structure, but they look like corporate structures in some ways, as a way to, you know, work together, band together, etc. And they are transported in many ways to the U.S. In terms of the immigrant side of it, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the things that, you know, especially in the records of the CMA, you see the black grocers alluding to the fact that, you know what, The Italian merchants have figured this out. The German merchants have figured this out. The Chinese merchants are doing it. What's wrong with us? Why can't we come together? In other words, why can't we follow what's already in place? So absolutely, I mean, this is as much an immigrant story as it is an American story, as is the grocery trade in particular. Is as much an immigrant story as an American story. Very much so. You were next. Yeah, in terms of that, that's a good question. You're kind of buying stock in IGA, and the CMA runs the same way as well. So you're buying a share, and you're a shareholder, and the shares that you own dictate, and the amount of shares that you own dictate the amount of credit you're able to get. And so from that standpoint, it's important to become a shareholder and a stakeholder. There is an organization at the top of president, individuals, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of the voting, I'm uncertain. I'm certain that being a shareholder, you had a vote. But what's clear in looking at the documents is that the organization imposes a lot of method, if you will, onto the grocers. In other words, in signing that agreement with the IGA, you're not only agreeing to, put up the signs and arrange your store and paint it, et cetera, and deal with the wholesale grocer. You're also agreeing to allow somebody to come in and look over your books and organize your books, if you will. They say it's organizing your books and systematizing your books, but it's really, just buying, essentially, trying to figure out how solid your business is. So you have to agree to let IGA designated accountants essentially come in and look over your books and give you suggestions on how to organize your business. You also have to allow the wholesaler and his troop of men to come in and arrange your store and give you suggestions on how to display things, et cetera, et cetera. So being a part of the IGA while your store is still owned independently, you are still beholden to what the parent organization would like you to do in terms of styling your store, organizing your store, doing your books, all of those kinds of things. So it's more involved than just signing a piece of paper and saying, and I'm an IGA member. Yeah, I'm certain there is. I don't know off the top of my head if there's a structure along a board of directors per se. I'll have to look into that more. Again, this is just part of the research that I've just kind of gotten my toes wet in, if you will. Yeah.
From the research that you looked at right now, and do you see enough type of information for either yourself or future researchers to find out if it's not just that items in other reasons why blacks may have wanted to start their own stores, such as I'm sure there were stores they couldn't go into at all, or have limited hours, or maybe poor quality items. Did you find enough information to kind of give background just for future researchers?
Yeah. The question has to do with, is there evidence that I've looked at that suggests why black grocers go into business short of, I want to start a business? That's thinner because much of what you get from the individual grocers and the evidence that I have actually, again, comes from those National Negro Business League meetings. And what happens at those meetings is they bring in examples of the successful guys to come up and tell their story. And what they did was to transcribe their speeches. And so the guys who have made a success of it come in and say, I started in business with $40. They don't necessarily, say why they started it. There's not a lot there. I mean, if you can read through the lines, if you will, between the lines, and understand that, especially in the North, the color line between white stores and black stores is less severe. In fact, white store owners frequently depended on black patronage to maintain their stores. In the South, the color line is more in place. So a black businessman opening a store in the South is going to know that he's going to have black business primarily. But again, as to why they enter the trade, I mean, there are myriad reasons, obviously. One of it has to do with the race issue of not being able necessarily to shop where they want, although that seems to me a lesser reason than the ability to be an independent businessman. And that actually speaks more to the failure of the CMA and holds these kind of concerns that these grocers are really not involved. Why aren't they getting involved with the CMA? And I read that as, I got my own business. I don't need you to tell me how to run it. I don't want you to tell me how to run it. People have been telling me how to run things my entire life. This is mine. I want to do it my way. I mean, I read it that way, and you can see elements of that. I mean, at one point, Halsey just says that, he honestly points out and says in a letter to Moten, he says, these grocers, I've just really put so much time into this organizations, and he calls them ungrateful. He says they're ungrateful because they're not giving anything back. One grocer writes to Halsey from the South, I can't remember, North Carolina, South Carolina, and says, I got your instructions on how to start a CMA group in my town. I'm really excited about it. And so we had a meeting of all the black grocers in the area. And on that first night, everybody was, it seemed interesting, and everybody was kind of interested in it. And we decided to table actually creating the organization until the next meeting. He says, and I had the next meeting, and nobody came. Nobody came. And so he was never able to get it off the ground. And so to me, it does, I mean, it reads a little like, I just don't want somebody telling me how to do things. I'm going to do it my way.
One question is, I know your research is limited to this particular time period, but I think I was helping with the conclusion. You also tell us how this historical background kind of what influenced the past and what happened after. Just an outline.
The question is, she was hoping I would take it up to the 21st century. My book cuts off basically in 1930, 1940 in particular. And what happens is, what I suggest, not just of this cooperation that takes place here, but the larger kind of importance of the small businessman and his methods, what you start to see actually happening in 2005, 6, 2007 are that organizations like Walmart and the big super chain stores, chain grocery stores. Number one, the chain grocery stores of today are having the same troubles that the independent businessmen had back in the teens and 20s with the corporate chains. Supermarket chains today are battling against Walmart. Walmart's the #1 food retailer these days. And what's interesting to me is much of the advice given out to supermarket chains today is basically boilerplate of what was handed around in the 19-teens and 20s in terms of how to compete. But the other thing that is interesting, and then I'll wrap up, is that even stores like Walmart and big chain stores, chain grocery stores, have started to make and build smaller stores. And they refer to them as neighborhood stores. And they start referencing, again, this kind of nostalgia about the small independent grocer. And so this is, it was a movement that was started in, again, mid-2006, 2007. I'm not sure how far they plan to carry it, But nevertheless, it's interesting to me to see them referencing, again, this ideal of the small businessman. And you have to ask yourself, when you're the #1 food retailer and you're as big as all the world, can you keep getting bigger?
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.